Charles Ponzi, the famous con man and originator of the Ponzi scheme, did his dastardly business on Hanover Street in Boston's famous North End.
Daddy wasn't finding a bow wow. Daddy wasn't finding a bow wow. I love my little cat. I'm very fond of that. I'd rather have a big bow wow 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 wow. Daddy
Hello
wasn't
and welcome to the
finding
Mochiverse.
a
I'm
bow
Linette.
wow.
And I'm Skip.
You are. How you doing today?
Uh, Peachy Keen, Wicked Pissa, all
Wicked
those.
It's cold here in Florida.
Yes, it is, and I know there's no sympathy from folks that are up north, but
No.
40 degrees is flipping cold, and it looks like some parts of Florida are going to have snow. I know, wham, 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 but not
Nothing compared to like the 9 inches they're getting everywhere else right now.
exactly. There's no comparison.
I mean,
Um,
yeah, I mean, I'm not bragging or anything, and I'm not trying to like shove it in anybody's face or anything, but it is true. Like, I always said I wasn't going to be one of those people who was cold after coming down here. I'm like, yeah, you live here for a few years and all of a sudden you're cold when it's like 50 degrees. But man, this last 2 years, and I've been here since 2016, these last 2 years, I have been cold. It's
It
been
has,
40.
yeah, it has been that way. I mean, it's like when you go out with a winter coat, which down here you don't usually do, but when you go out with a winter coat down here, it's like it feels kind of weird, but that's what you need, you
Oh
know.
yeah. Oh yeah. And I was
Um,
saying before we started recording, I was telling you I bought the first pair of gloves I've had since moving down here.
yep, yep.
Just couldn't do it anymore. Plus, I needed gloves that would let me touch my phone, you know.
Yeah, they make a lot of the gloves come that way now. And as I said to you, I bought some of those hot hands.
Oh yeah.
Uh, I had bought some for my brother, and I said, this is not a bad idea. Don't need them very often, but boy, I'll tell you, you're out walking the dog, it gets cold in the certainly in the fingertips. So
It does. And it's really the wind because a couple of days ago it was also 40 degrees, but it wasn't windy and it felt
mhm,
perfectly fine. It was
yep,
no problem. It really is when that wind kicks up because it's also wet here. We just had thunderstorms yesterday
yep,
and it just feels miserable. And it's funny because I was talking about this just a couple of days ago. Richard finds it funny that, people walking around in shorts when it's 45 degrees. But tried to explain, there's a huge difference between it being just being 40 degrees and it being like 2 degrees for 3 months and then going to 40 degrees.
yeah,
That's a
exactly.
huge difference. It feels like a tropical paradise when you've had February, in New England, and then all of a sudden it's like 45 degrees and you're out there, you fire up the barbecue and
It
put
feels
shorts on.
darn right balmy.
It
And
does. It does. We're all walking out there with our sweatshirts and our Bermuda shorts.
yeah, I know when I'd come down and visit, and it would be, in the high 50s, and I'm in what, shorts and t-shirts, and the couple we were visiting, are in winter coats with gloves and hats, and
Yeah.
and I'm going, what the heck's wrong with you? This is nothing.
I
Well,
remember I remember you talked about that and you were like, they were like, what do you want to do today? And you were like, oh, let's go to the beach. They're like, beach. All right. Ugh, it's like 50 degrees out. Okay, I guess we'll go
that's
to the
it.
beach.
Yeah, exactly. Just yeah, for 50 degrees, it's kind of, my brothers come down and visited, and they were in shorts and t-shirts, and I had 3 layers of clothes
Yeah.
on when it was in the high 40s, and they're like, what's wrong with you? So
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But see, we know, like in New England, we know how to go to a beach in the winter anyways. It's not
yeah,
about, adults don't swim in the ocean in New England. That's
no,
for the kids.
that's right,
You walk on the
exactly.
beach.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter. Oh my goodness. Well, that was fun. So today, folks, we're going to talk about Boston, I guess. We're going to talk about a famous part of Boston, and we're going to talk about a very famous incident that happened in Boston, something that's absolutely fascinating, really tragic, and it's actually really amazing when you start to look into it, like how bad it really was, as opposed to like the way that people just talk about it when they're halfway familiar with it.
Yep.
So we're going to talk about the Boston molasses flood today. I don't know how many of you folks know about it who aren't from like New England or whatever, but I had vaguely heard about it as I was growing up, and it was kind of the same thing, Dad, about how I grew up listening to the song 30,000 Pounds of Bananas that we talked
Hmm.
about. When you're a
Yep.
kid, you know, you're just thinking about the silliness of the story, and it's like, oh my goodness, like somebody tells you that a tank full of molasses exploded and a wave of molasses like just burst out and splashed all over the city. When you're a kid, you're like, that's awesome. That's funny. You think that it's like a funny, goofy thing because it's like, it's molasses, it's sticky, it's
Yep.
sweet, it's like, I don't know. It seems comical. It seems cartoonish. Um, but actually it was a very big deal and it was a very awful, terrible thing. And I picked this particular story on purpose because I have already done this subject in a previous podcast that I had, Sofa Spud's History, with my friend Jess. And we did cover the story, but as a lot of you folks know, my dad is from Boston and his family is from the North End of Boston. So I thought it would be cool to have that perspective into the story. I was going to tell some of the facts of the story, some of the history of the area, and then we were going to maybe have a little talk about some of your perspectives about that neighborhood and about the town and about things you know about it. And well, the first thing I wanted to start with was like, Dad, when you were a kid, did you guys ever talk about the molasses flood?
Uh, my grandfather told me about it, and I think for a lot of folks in that neighborhood, their kids, unlike what happens nowadays, the kids would be out all day playing.
Yeah.
And that particular day, it was 40 degrees, which, as we have spoken about, is after it's been in the 20s and even in zero, 40 degrees is balmy. So everybody goes out and tries to enjoy it.
Right.
So when that happened, there was a loud bang, and a lot of the parents in the neighborhood were all panicky, wondering where their kids were, because it would be fun for them to go down, wander the area. And oh, by the way, one of the problems with that molasses tank was that the seals weren't that good, so molasses would be dripping. So the kids would go down there and take some,
Right.
grab some molasses.
Yes,
So
exactly, exactly.
yeah.
And that was a big part of my research as well, learning about that. It was just absolutely horrifying. But yeah. Yeah, do you remember what your grandfather had to say like about it was probably very matter of fact from his
Yeah,
generation.
matter of fact, I think that, for him, it was just like what I was saying. I mean, his kids were small, so they had the same thing. They were all panicking as to where their kids were, trying to make sure they knew where their kids were at that particular time, to make sure they hadn't gone down there yet, gone down to that area. So,
That's right. He would have already had kids by then because
yep.
what, your dad
Mhm.
was one of the younger ones, right?
Yes. Yep.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, my dad was born 19.
One of the younger ones before the next wave of kids.
Right. My dad was born in 1921.
Oh,
So obviously he wasn't the youngest, but he was, I think, the second youngest. So there were others that were preteens, so
oh, wow.
that's what preteens do. Is
Right,
wander the
exactly.
neighborhood, get into trouble, throw rocks at the molasses tank, or whatever you want to call it.
It was your great aunt. It was her fault.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, my aunt did it.
Oh my
She always
goodness.
had a good arm. So
Yeah. Oh no, aunt. Yeah, that's right. It wouldn't be great aunt. It would be aunt. Be
yeah,
my great aunt.
By the way, when you talk about the North End, you go the not end.
Oh,
Which
really? Is that how you
it kind
say it?
of because the not end, and
The
that's
not end?
some of that is the Bostonian thing. Which, by the way, really quickly, all those folks that are not from the Boston area and they make fun of the Boston accent, I
Yeah.
want you to take some time and listen to the English accents and the Australian accents, and notice they drop their R's also.
Yeah, they sure
So,
do. Yeah,
yeah,
as much as they make fun.
yeah, right.
If you listen to the Maine accent, which is also very similar, they never say they never say R's in Maine either, and yet we're the ones in Massachusetts who get made fun of. Never
Yep,
understood that.
yeah,
Their accent is so much grander than ours. They all sound like Kennedys over there.
yep, yep.
Yeah, so what I figured I would do is start by talking a little bit about the North End itself, especially for people who aren't familiar, and even for people who grew up there, or people who visited there. It's a very interesting place because it changed a lot over the years, and there is a lot of history to it comparatively, since Boston is, quite an old city for such a young country. So I did a little bit of reading on the North End, and I guess it first became like a distinct neighborhood in the mid 1600s. So that's pretty amazing. Boston very quickly built up as soon as it was established, and especially that area of Boston that's by the water, by the shipping areas, by the ports. You can imagine that a lot of buildings would go up pretty quickly to accommodate the shipping business and accommodate the people who were working around it and living or starting to live around it. So that makes sense. And people important to the town would be as close to the action as they possibly could. Something I learned when I was doing my research brought up a very familiar name to my old history classes. The last name Mather. Okay, so when I was a kid, you heard the name Cotton Mather, and a lot of people my generation may not have heard that name, but since I grew up in Salem, I knew the name Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was one of the men kind of instrumental and responsible for the Salem witch trials and perpetuating the panic of the Salem witch trials and making it just pretty horrible. But his father, Increase Mather, I love these names, was a very important person in Boston, apparently. And he established, I guess he was like a preacher of some sort. He established the Old North Meeting House, which was later called the Old North Church. And he founded it with just a few people. Like he was doing like sermons in his house for a while. And then once he had a few people gathered, again, remember, this is like the 1600s. There weren't as many people in Massachusetts yet. He established like the Old North Meeting House. The Mather residence, which was nearby, it was destroyed in a fire. But that land where the Mather house was is actually where the Paul Revere house is. And I'm sure you know where that is, Dad.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's right there.
The not end, the not end.
In the Nada. It's near the pepperonis.
Yeah. Right near Prince Spaghetti House. Here you go.
Yes, I have some notes about that, which is really funny. It actually got me how little people know about Prince Spaghetti who aren't from New England. I thought it was a national thing, and I guess it kind of was, but I don't know. Richard didn't remember anything about it, but we'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, so 2 year it was funny because 2 years after the Mather house was destroyed by a fire was when the very first paid fire department was started in Boston. It's kind of interesting how it's just like, whoops, you missed it. And a lot of these history stories you hear about, it's just like 2 days after this rule was enacted and things like that. So also that North Meeting House that I talked about, it was actually dismantled for firewood by the British during the siege of Boston, which was like in the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So
And wasn't the Paul Revere House built on where
it
the
was
Mather residence was?
It was built where the Mather residence was, yes. The North Meeting House, the old wooden structure was dismantled by the British, but I think it was rebuilt as brick and it's still there.
Yeah, and that was really North Meeting House really isn't in North End. It's more in what I call downtown Boston.
Oh, okay. See, I don't know any of this. I went to Boston quite a few times, but I'm not as familiar with Boston itself as you would be because you probably spent a lot of time in this specific area.
Yep.
So something I didn't know, the North End was actually like a really wealthy area when it was first, not when it was first established, but like in the 18th century. So like, 50 to 100 years later, like in the 1700s. There were a lot of mansions in the neighborhood, and I guess that kind of makes sense if the founders of the town were sort of living near there. I guess just as it happens over time, by the 1800s, the area was slowly becoming more commercial. To me, that makes sense because of the water being right there. It's going to
Right.
become more commercial if you've got like a harbor right there. You have a port right there.
Right.
And the rich people moved into places like Beacon Hill. And so when that happened, it kind of evolved into sort of like a downtrodden, more downtrodden area. Those mansions gave way to like tenement homes, and it became more of like a high crime area. And there was actually a red light district in the North End known as the Black Sea. Which I like. It's so interesting how they name these things. I mean, the one that was in Boston when I was a kid that we heard about, it was called the Combat Zone,
Combat zones. Right. Yep.
which
Yep.
is just really funny. When I casually talk about it to people not from Boston, they're like, "What?" I'm like, "Yeah, the Combat Zone." They're like, "What the heck is that?"
Right.
Like,
Right.
that's just what they call it. It's just they just have a nickname for those kind of places, which I think is very funny. Yeah, so and because it was like a rundown area now, it was becoming commercial, it was becoming basically low rent, it was a lot of crime happening. When the waves of immigration started to come in, when the waves of immigrants came in, that was where they sort of went. I mean, they could afford to be there. So over time, there were multiple waves of immigrants coming in. Of course, the Irish came in just absolute droves during the potato famine. And then, of course, like Jewish and Italian immigrants came in there. And then one of the first things I learned about the North End when I was researching it was that it used to be not predominantly necessarily, but it was a big Jewish area just as much as it was Italian,
Right.
which you never really associate it with. You just associate it with being, the Italian parts, Little Italy.
Yep.
Kind of interesting.
Yeah. What would happen is just a quick
Sure.
note was that the Irish would move across what we call the bridge to Charlestown,
Yeah.
and the Jewish would go to the west end of Boston.
Okay.
That's kind of where the settlements, and then the Italians just stayed in that area in the north end. Uh,
But I did research that, like, you've got your first generation immigrants that come in and they form like a little neighborhood of all, sort of isolated, all just themselves. But then, like, the second and third generations, they do sort of move away. They do sort of branch out. They do sort of go away from those little areas. And it's kind of sad to me, but it also seems kind of inevitable.
well, yeah, I mean, one of the things to note is that there were immigrant policies at that
Right.
time
Right.
uh, made it essential, if you will, for them to have neighborhoods that are predominantly, Irish, Italian, or Jewish, because when you come into the country in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you didn't necessarily have to have a job, but if you didn't have a job, you had to have a sponsor or a sponsoring family.
Right.
And that was really necessary. So, in order for that to happen, you tend to have groups of neighborhoods that would be, the same ethnic origin. That's really the foundation of a lot of immigration that came into this country, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was they would settle in areas where family was already established. My grandmother on the Irish side was 13 years old when she came to this country.
Oh,
So
wow.
she had to have a sponsor or a family that she would be staying with in order for her to be allowed to come into the country.
Yeah, I mean, and that makes perfect sense. I mean, can you imagine? Oh my gosh. Can you imagine going by yourself at age 13 to another country to live there and probably not really knowing the people you were going to live with too well? They're relatives
No,
who've lived in another country for how many years? How well do you know them? You know what I mean?
yeah, likely not, but they would be like cousins. And it's
Yeah.
funny, the areas that they come from, like the family came from County Cork. And if you look at the history of County Cork, there, you would see a lot of names and a lot of history that would basically be cousins.
Yeah.
So that's sort of interesting, and it's probably the same, and I'm sure it's the same with the Italians and the Jewish.
Oh,
If
absolutely. Didn't you say that the town when we finally when they finally found the town that your grandfather came from, it was like every other person was a mocha
if
in that town.
if yeah, just about,
Like mocha this, mocha that, mocha, mocha, mocha. And actually, if I was Googling one day just the last name and it came up with that same town and it wasn't even
yep.
anybody I'd ever heard of. So
Yeah, it's funny, that yeah, that whole town is definitely that's that way. If they're not, if they're not of that family, they are related cousins or whatever, so
yeah,
anyway.
that's hey, that's how it was. And plus that was a mountainous area. So like kind of I don't know the geography because I've never been there, but I can imagine a long, long time ago, areas in the mountains of Italy, small villages, they would have been isolated.
Pretty much,
Probably nothing for miles and you just,
yeah,
each other.
yeah, yeah. No, in that area was also a lot of farmlands. So
Yeah, that's true. That's
yeah,
true. That's fascinating. I love that. So, because the neighborhood was kind of sort of falling into disrepair, uh, so charitable organizations started to come in to try and help the populations there. A lot of the buildings were like run down, sort of wooden buildings. They tore all that down, replaced it with like the brick that you see there. They also constructed the North End Park, Cops Hill Terrace, and the North End Playground. And then by the early 20th century, by that time, it was predominantly Italian and Jewish. And then so that's where I get to my Prince, my Prince thing. And I didn't know that the company was that old. In 1912, three immigrants from Sicily started the Prince Macaroni Company on Prince Street. And they just, I guess, named it after the street they were on. Um,
yeah,
it's so funny because, like, you know, we grew up. You eat spaghetti on Wednesdays because the commercial told us to. Like
right.
Wednesday is Prince Spaghetti Day, and then you grow up with the commercial, Anthony, Anthony, And I told that to Richard. He'd never heard of Prince Spaghetti Day. He never heard of Wednesday being Spaghetti Day.
Yep.
I was like, wait, I thought it was the entire country that did that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think that the way that area developed, but in the 1900 by 1900 the Italian population was about 14,000.
Yeah.
Over the next 20 years, it would double to 37,000, and then by 1930, 44,000 were in the area. It's less than a mile in size. And
Wow.
at the time, the neighborhood had become like 100% Italians, which is, in the 20s, 30s, whatever. That's where my dad lived in the North End.
Right, right.
And then over time is always the case when each ethnic group gets a prejudice against them. The A lot of negative feelings towards the Italians
Oh, sure.
happened, and then they organized crime get in there. So it's interesting how that whole area is developed.
Oh,
But it
sure.
still remains, if you go to the North End nowadays, there is an old world feel to the area.
Hmm.
Um, I went there, maybe 10 years ago with my wife, and we toured the area. And to me, it was sort of amazing how there were things that were still there from when I was a kid,
Oh, sure.
so.
Oh, yeah. It's incredible. I've only I didn't really go to Boston that much, but I did go to the North End a couple of times, and I just loved it. It really does feel like a very like an old European neighborhood.
Yeah,
It's very cool.
yeah, it really does. It's sort of funny. I just maybe flashed to a story that I was playing softball for the phone company, and me and the group came to the North End for a get together.
Mhm.
And, same restaurants that were always there when I was growing up, European. And another time I went there with my wife, and the guy that was the head waiter was a childhood friend of my dad's,
That's so
so
cool. That is
yeah,
so cool. Yeah,
yeah,
we went to a restaurant in the North End one time and first of all, the guy wouldn't give us a menu.
mhm,
He just said, "What do you like?" And I was
yeah,
like, I don't know." And he's like, "What do you like?" And I'm like, "I like lots of things." And he's like, "Okay, do you like artichokes?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I like artichokes." He goes, "Okay, bye." And then he like left.
yeah,
And he just brought me something that he knew I would like. There were no like there's no menu. And then halfway through dinner, this woman just gets up in the middle of the restaurant and starts singing opera. It was fantastic.
yeah. And a lot of the restaurants on side streets and stuff, you go in, they're just like one room,
Yeah.
like it's somebody's living room. And a
Yeah.
lot of the restaurants are like that, and it's you get the home cooked meals. It's interesting. It's kind of just what you were just talking about.
That's so cool. Yeah, the
Yeah.
restaurant. And I mean, I also, the shops and everything are
Oh yeah.
fantastic.
Well, we can't see enough of that. There's bakeries and
Oh,
pizza places and Italian food, all over the place. The famous bakeries is it was sort of a tradition for every one of our birthdays. My mother would go down to the North End and get us a rum cake for our birthday. So
and where was that one from? Which place?
geez, I think it was Michael's or something like that. I don't remember the name of it. I
Oh.
remember even going in there and picking up as I got older, going in and picking up the cakes for my brothers. So
Oh yeah. Well, because I know that I'm sure this happens in any city because I know New York is famous for having arguments about this and Philadelphia is famous for having arguments about this, but certainly within a group of I would say four people, there's three best bakeries, right? Like when you're talking about what's the best Italian bakery in the North End, and you got four people saying it, and there's three choices because they're like, no, 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 don't go there. You got to go there.
yeah, well, it's funny you say that because it just brings up for me Bova's Bakery.
Hmm.
And honest to this day, I don't know how my dad did it because he never drove. Was that he'd wake us up in the morning with a piece of warm bread coated in butter that he had picked up at Bova's Bakery. And my best way, the only way that I can figure is he went over at like 4 o'clock in the morning when stuff came out of the bakery, and
Right.
he would have probably had to take a cab and come home and do that. And the other thing was over there talk about when I talk about this area, Pizzeria Regina. Been there since
Oh yeah.
the
Forever.
early maybe 1900 somewhere. Martinetti's, used to be a famous place. You get all your Italian
Oh yeah.
cold cuts and meats. And there was the Salem Meat Market. There's on Salem Street. You go in there, and it's an old-fashioned butchery. It's just on and on and on with memories for me. But anyway, I digressed on that. So
No, that's awesome. I mean, I suffer from bouts of nostalgia from time to time. And a lot
mhm.
of the nostalgia I have is for a time I wasn't around for. I just think it would have been so neat. I'm sure there were other problems at the
Yeah,
time, but I just think it would have been so neat to be in one of those city neighborhoods that just you had a business for this, you got the baker guy over here, this is the place you go for your meats. This is the guy you go to for your general sort of grocery. That's the corner store over here. That's it. And you stayed in your sort of little neighborhood and all these nice little businesses were thriving and
it's
everybody
it's
knew each other.
just
I don't know. I
it's
think
just
that's
unbelievable. And it's funny. I just flash back, and you think about the way things are when you go into places now. If you went into a butchery now,
yeah.
just think about how it'd be set up. I can remember going in the Salem meat market, and the first thing that strikes you is all over the floor is sawdust.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, because of all the
uh,
blood it has to catch.
right, right. It's just like you would just
Yeah.
not see that nowadays.
No, and of course, and there's like, there's dead things hanging from the
Well, yeah,
ceiling as well. You know,
rabbits and pigs and
yeah, all that stuff. And you got like
fish, dried up fish and all that stuff.
dried up fish, and if you if you went to certain neighborhoods, you're buying a head of something to take home
Right,
with you,
right.
depending on the economic status of that particular time. You're going to eat like a pig head,
Yeah,
whatever, for your, you know, some kind of crazy stuff, eyeballs and all kinds of other terrible
yeah,
things that I am too privileged to be able to talk about having to eat, which I'm
yeah.
very happy for.
Yeah, it's funny you were talking about the Prince Spaghetti house to sort of to go back to the, the history and the things that happened in that neighborhood. And this was something else that my grandfather talked about was the Spanish flu, which was
Yes.
in 1918. It hit the whole area hard. And with the Spanish flu, a lot different than COVID in that people in the morning would be sick and by nighttime they'd be dead.
Yeah.
And my grandfather would be saying that people would be dropping in the street. And a lot of times it was mostly the young people because young people, as is always the case with young folks, is that they feel they're invincible.
Yeah, and they hang
So
around each other and do social things and yeah, I mean that must have been terrifying to live through because especially the way that that flu acted because it was kind of unpredictable and it was
yep,
kind of random as well. You would have three people living in a small house together and two of them die and one of them never even got sick. It's like
right.
what even happened here?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And yeah, it goes on and on. I mean, there'd be doctors that would be treating patients in the morning, and those doctors would be dead at the evening.
Dead
So
before their
that's
patients. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And the thing that's when you think about it, as I'm looking now and thinking about it, that was 1918, and 1919 was the molasses flood. So
Exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
it must have. I mean, you can imagine that people were still sort of the neighborhood was still sort of recovering from that.
yep,
Because I mean the flu lasted into 1919 as well,
yep,
um but you can imagine like there was still people especially economically recovering because a lot of families would have lost their breadwinners
yeah,
depending on who died in their family, that sort of thing. It's
right.
awful to think about, but
And more to the point is that like the COVID-19, which we recently experienced, there's amount of time where it's still around because it takes a finite amount of a time for any precautions to be put in place
right.
to become effective.
Right. And especially something like a flu, it becomes endemic. It's just a thing that happens in your area every however length of time. It's amazing, actually. Um,
And throw in World War I.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. It was a really rough time to be a person at that time. I think,
Uh,
especially,
Otherwise than that, everything was fine.
yeah, everything was great. Come on, there was molasses everywhere. Uh, let's talk about the molasses flood. So, a little background of the company. Now we talked about the area, and in that time, that area of Boston, that area of the North End, it was recovering economically from its time as a economically depressed area, but it was still a working class area, and it was becoming more and more commercial. You got commercial, you got residences, you got people living right next to factories and living right next to manufacturing plants and all kinds of things, living right near the docks. You'd be living upstairs from a business. That sort of thing happens a lot in the city anyways. There was quite a lot of industry coming up at that time, and especially, the beginning of the 20th century. Um, and when you talk about World War One, this company was becoming quite important around that time. So the Purity Distilling Company, this was a Boston company, but it was a subsidiary of a much larger company called the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. This company, I did a little bit of research on it, but basically, when you Google the name of that company, it really just talks about the molasses flood. But that's because this was such a big thing. But it was a huge important company. And the tank for the Purity Distilling Company was built, I think, 1915, and it was on 529 Commercial Street, which I'm sure you're familiar with that sort of area, exactly where that is.
Yeah, Commercial Street. My recollection of where that would have been, because when I see pictures from the remnants of the flood,
Yeah.
and its proximity to where the overhead, the elevated was. There was
Yes.
a bridge we called the High Bridge,
Yep.
and right at the corner of the High Bridge is where Atlantic Avenue
Yes.
is right where it would have been,
Yeah,
and
that's
that's
right there. Yep, because that's where the elevated the little station for the elevated railway, Atlantic Street, was right there. So Charles Edward Adams, who lived from 1881 to 1957, he was the chairman of the board for the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. He was also, I don't know if it was at the same time, he was also the director of the Federal Reserve Bank. Thank you very much. He went to Yale. He was a member of Skull and Bones, which, if you folks have ever heard of Skull and Bones, that pretty much tells you all you need to know. But Skull and Bones was a secret society at Yale University, still is. Some of their former members include the Bushes, John Kerry, and just about every rich and powerful person you can think of who went to Yale. So we're talking high society, we're talking big power, we're talking politics. There are currently alleged, I have to say alleged because I don't want anybody coming after me, uh, conspiracy theories that they're part of the Illuminati, uh, that they're part of a global conspiracy for world control. Take from that what you will. But this guy was like in that society. So we're talking basically the villain from It's a Wonderful Life, right? That's what this guy is. He's just he's just a bad rich guy, the big banker guy. So the tank on Commercial Street, it was 50 feet tall. And you ever see the picture of it before the explosion?
No, I didn't see the picture of it.
So, yeah, if you Google it, it's really interesting. It really gives you a perspective of how big this thing was. It was 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, but there's a really good photo of it
Mhm.
from, I think, 1916, shot from the perspective right near the elevated railway. So you can imagine how tall the elevated railway was. And then you just see the tank kind of towering, like coming above that. So you could really only see half of it. So that's how tall that damn thing was. So, I mean, the elevated railway must go up like what, 30 feet or something like that.
Oh, anyways, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So you can see it like it's almost like the camera was on the railway and then you see the tank right there and you're seeing like half of the tank and it's big. It's huge. It had a capacity of 2.3 million gallons. So that's not even, I mean, I can't even picture that. I don't know about you. So what would happen is right near it's close to the water. Ships would bring in the molasses and it was put into the tank for storage. And then later it would be transferred. It said pipeline when I did some of my research, but I also found some pictures of the molasses being transported by like trucks or little, there's like a train car that went by with like a big, not big, but like a tank full of molasses, a smaller tank full of molasses that they would put it into to transport it to the actual factory, which is on Willow Street and Everett's Way in Cambridge. So that's probably pretty
Okay.
far, right?
Yeah, pretty far away. Yeah.
Yeah. So the tank was built in 1915, and we're going to take a little journey into unregulated industry in the early 1900s. First of all, the tank was constructed poorly, according to a few articles I read. And I know it's tempting to say it was a different time and things weren't whatever, but it was constructed poorly for the time, from what people are saying. So you can imagine that there are standards for constructing a metal tank meant to hold a heavy viscous liquid. 2.3 million gallons, remember? I mean, there were welding issues, there were issues in the seam. This tank was about half as thin or half as thick as it was supposed to be to hold any liquids.
Yeah.
So it wasn't thick enough. It was quite thin. And the steel that it was made out of didn't contain manganese, which I'm not an engineer. I don't know everything about like steel production, but when you're constructing steel, if you don't have manganese in it, it's more brittle. It's not
Right.
as strong. And like I guess half the rivets weren't put in right. I mean, it was pretty awful. So it would be standard nowadays and probably not standard, but kind of understood that when you construct a tank that's supposed to hold liquid, you have to like, I don't know, put some liquid into it to see if it's going to hold the liquid after you build it.
Right.
That was not done. They didn't test it. So what happened was this that guy Charles Edward Adams, he appointed the treasurer of his company in like to oversee the construction and inspection of this tank. So this guy, he had no engineering experience, no engineering degree, no architectural experience, no practical had this works experience. Like he was just he was the treasurer, and probably like you and I said before, probably his buddy. You know, if he's the treasurer of the company, he's probably the next, you know, the next closest confidant to like the CEO or whatever. So he's just like, yeah, 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 I'll put you in charge of that. I'll give you this much money to do so. And he, you know, he didn't.
I think that what's interesting, when you're talking about the flood itself, you think about this uh, kind of the reasons that it happened.
Right.
With any change in temperature, you get expansion and contraction. And one of the things that happened at that particular time, you consider that was in January.
It was,
And
yeah.
in January in Boston, traditionally is colder than one of the coldest months. It's really, it can, get down to zero and even lower.
Mhm.
And that day it was 40, which, as we've spoke about earlier on, that's, that feels balmy after you're in like 0 degree
Absolutely.
temperature.
Absolutely. And what happened in this case too is that not only was it 40 that day, but it had been 2 degrees every day in the
Mhm.
days leading up to that 40-degree day.
Yep. Yep.
And so unseasonably warm temperatures all of a sudden in a tank. Now, the other thing that I want to like, I know I'm all over the place today, but the other thing I want to talk about with molasses was used by this company. The reason they had this molasses tank in the first place, the molasses was used in the production of alcohol. And this particular company used the alcohol for industrial purposes, for munitions. And of course, this is, this would be like World War I era. That's going to be really important. So, a little thing about alcohol production, it involves fermentation. So, you've got this large amount of molasses, which is mainly sugar, and that sugar, the stuff in it, will ferment. Fermentation is the process that creates the alcohol, but fermentation also causes other things like gases and expansion and contraction of things. So what happens with this tank as well is that, like I said, it held 2.3 million gallons, but it was only filled to capacity 8 times. And what they would normally do is they would fill it with whatever shipment they got, and it would sit in the tank, and then they'd take some of it out for their use, whatever they needed, and then the rest of it would sit in the tank. And then they'd get another shipment and just dump it on top of the stuff that was already in the tank, which, by the way, was already fermenting on its own. This was just a storage tank. It wasn't heating it up, but it's going to start fermenting on its own if it's just held somewhere.
Right.
And it's obviously not insulated, so temperature changes have a huge factor in that. And when you're talking about something that's metal, you're going to talk about metal fatigue. I mean, there's just so many problems that could happen from something like that. There are some people who said that the reason why the tank was never really filled to capacity was that this owner guy was trying to outrace prohibition. Now, prohibition wasn't going to happen for a little while yet. However, you're talking about a big, powerful guy who probably has a lot of inside information about what's to come in this state of the country.
Well,
And,
yeah.
he's an alcohol producer. So
Yep.
he's going to want to produce as much alcohol as he can, as quickly as he can, before prohibition happens. Um,
Yeah, and that, by the way, that's probably more relevant than making it for munitions, because
sure.
the reality was that World War I was ended, and there was probably still stuff going on, but as is always the case when manufacturing is producing something, they're always looking for other uses of the material they're producing,
Yep.
particularly alcohol. So yes, that's probably in anticipation
Yep.
of getting ahead of the next big thing.
Yep. And 2 days after this disaster was when prohibition was
Right.
when that was ratified. So yeah, he knew.
No. Yep.
So you're talking about a lot of factors involved, but this 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 tank was just doomed from the start.
Yep.
Um, And like you said, it had leaks, and it had leaks from the day it was manufactured.
Yep.
And everybody in town knew about it, that it was leaking. And the kids would go, and actually the women in the neighborhood too, would
Yep.
would go and, kind of with buckets and cups and things like that and come and grab some of that molasses. But they also complained about it to the company. And when they complained about it to the company, that they were seeing leaks and they were seeing molasses oozing out of the tank, well, the company decided the best thing to do was to solve the problem by painting the tank brown.
Of course.
So there you go.
Unintended knee-jerk reaction
Yeah,
uh,
exactly. So you've
gets
got,
unintended consequences. Yep.
yes. So you got this tank that's being emptied and filled possibly very quickly. And by the way, this tank is only 4 years old at the time of this disaster.
Yeah.
This is a building. It's 4 years old. It failed after 4 years. But it's like, it was built shitty to begin with. And you've got these shipments coming and going, coming and going. You've got it half filled, you got a little bit in the bottom, maybe. You got it filled all the way up, and then you're emptying it really quickly after it's been able to expand for a day or two with all the seasons that are going by. We talk about this happening in the winter, but the summer was a factor as well over those 4 years.
Yep.
Fermentation is going to happen a lot more quickly in the summer. And as much as people know that it's cold in New England, I don't think they realize how hot it gets in the summer in New England, even by the ocean. Like the temperatures that I experienced in New England, I still haven't experienced down here in Florida, the actual temperatures. Now, granted, it's hotter for longer down here, but we used to have heat waves that were like way hotter than any of the hottest days here. So, and the fact that it lasts for just a little bit of time, that's a lot of pressure on a tank filled with fermenting liquid.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. All right. So on January 14th, this is 1919, a new delivery of molasses arrived. I didn't find exactly how much molasses came, or I didn't also see whether the tank was like what the capacity was of the tank, like whether it was half full or whether there was just a little bit in it. But it wasn't empty. And suffice it to say, the volume was enough to strain the structure further. And so the other thing to remember about molasses, everybody knows the consistency of molasses, right? It's very thick, it's viscous, and of course, we know it moves slowly because that's the joke, right? So you can imagine it's not easy to pump it from like a ship into a tank. So
Right.
what do you have to do? They have to warm it up, they have to heat it up. So you've got hot molasses coming into this tank. Who knows how many gallons? And that's going to strain it too, because what's in the tank, whatever's in the tank, is cold. Because as I said, up until the day of the disaster, it had been 2 degrees most days and a lot of wind and just very, very, very cold. So you've got almost frozen molasses sitting in a container and you pour a bunch of hot stuff on top of it. So the next day, which was January 15th, and depending on when you listen to this, you'll know we just had January 15th and it was the 105th anniversary of this. And what I thought was cool, it's cool, but it's just like somebody will just say I'm being stupid. But it was the same calendar day too. It was the same day of the week. It was a Wednesday, which this year than it was when this happened. I don't know why I think that's cool, but I thought it was cool. So on that day, January 15th, is when the temperature had gone up from 2 degrees to 40. So the rapid increase in temperature, it must have put that extra strain on the tank. And there was also a fracture in the manhole cover near the base. So there was like probably the cover where they pumped some of the stuff in or whatever. There was a fracture in the manhole cover, and that was what gave way. It just completely broke and the whole tank burst open and collapsed. Like I said, I don't know exactly how full it was, but it was full enough for what was to come, this huge disaster. Residents later reported hearing a long rumble similar to the sound of the passing train, because they had the elevated railway right there. Others said it sounded like a deep growling and a thunderous crash and bang, and everyone felt the ground shake. And then some also reported hearing what sounded like machine gun fire. And what that sound was the rivets popping out of the tank as it burst open, which is just terrifying. So molasses, as you know, we talked about a couple minutes ago, it's quite a bit thicker than water, something like 40 times thicker.
Mhm.
And so the energy from the collapse would have created a lot of force, like potential energy. These are all terms I learned about like more than 20 years ago, so bear with me. Actually, I think I just made myself sound a lot younger than I am. It was a very long time ago. We're talking like 30 something years ago that I learned all this stuff. 35 years ago, I learned all this stuff. So I don't remember a lot of it. But anyway, physics, a lot of momentum for this liquid to travel outwards, especially with an explosion. The wave of molasses that overtook the area was 25 feet high at its peak. So presumably the tank could have been at least half full, but even if it wasn't, that wave coming out of there, 25 feet high. And it was moving at 35 miles an hour, which, if you can imagine something hitting something else at 35 miles an hour can cause some damage. It right away it crashed into the elevated railways Atlantic Ave structure, which is right there, and it just bashed it to hell. And there was a train car that was tipped off the tracks momentarily. It knocked 6 buildings off of their foundations, including Firehouse 31, where one of the victims who died, he was a firefighter. He had just gone to sleep, reportedly. The whole elevated railway was destroyed, as well as the freight depot and the city paving department office and the stable that went with that. 21 people were killed, some by the impact of either the wave itself or the debris, and some by drowning, which is just terrible. There were 150 people injured, and some of the dead were swept into the harbor, not found for 3 to 4 months. Several cars were thrown and damaged. A Mack truck was hurled into the side of a building. Cars were thrown against lampposts. A horse and buggy was thrown, killing the horse, and several motorized boxcars were destroyed. And what happened as soon as that initial wave was over, then the molasses quickly started to harden because it had been 40 degrees. But then, of course, it's going to get cold again. Temperatures were dropping down to the usual. And so, I don't know, it's just really awful to think about. But the drowning victims, not only are you drowning, not only were you were either hit by the impact of this wave, which could kill you, 35 miles an hour, you're hit by something, you could die, or you're being hit by debris, or you're drowning in a liquid that you can't free yourself from because it's not water. And even if somebody comes to try and rescue you, they may not be able to pull you out. And 12 horses were killed, and according to newspapers, uncounted numbers of dogs and cats. So this is just crazy. The people who died were largely laborers and other workers in the area. Like I saw there's a list of the names. If you look on Wikipedia and other sources, they'll have the list of the names of the people who died. A lot of them you could see, like, there was the firefighter was there, but a lot of like dock workers and things like that, laborers. But there were 2 kids. So one of the children was Maria DeStasio. She was 10 years old. Her brother Anthony, there's a little story in one of the newspapers. He was swept away and injured, but he survived. And Maria was standing right in front of the tank when it exploded because, like we talked about before, you were talking about the kids.
Mhm.
So Maria and her brother and her friend Pasquale were going by the tank because they were going to take some firewood from the tank, which, all the kids knew that was a good place to get firewood. You bring it home to your family. But also, they were going to take their little sticks and they were going to make little molasses lollipops from the molasses that had been leaking from the tank. And it was like all over the ground and stuff. So they were doing that and they were always getting told off by workers in the area. And at the time that the tank exploded, Maria was being scolded by one of the workers and she was standing right in front of it. So Pasquale, he was also 10. He was struck by a railroad car that was swept by the wave, and his father witnessed it. He was looking out the window at his house or whatever, and he saw his son getting hit and swept away. But they didn't find him for 5 days, which is just awful. And like I said, of course, a lot of the victims were drowning victims, which is horrific. A lot of them were hit by debris, and so 21 people in total. And after the initial wave died down, it just kept flooding into the streets. And they said it was about 2 or 3 feet deep in some places. So you can imagine how difficult that would be. Shortly after this explosion, a bunch of people tried to come and help. There were 116 cadets on a training ship, the USS Nantucket. They were the first to get to the scene. They pulled out survivors and they also worked to keep onlookers from getting too close. So, and that's amazing. You could imagine such a quick response, and you can imagine military cadets they're trained for that sort of thing, you know. So 116 people getting to the scene very quickly. It must have been a huge help. The Army, Navy, Red Cross, and police also arrived, and the Red Cross set up a makeshift hospital nearby. They worked to tend to injuries, try to keep people warm because, of course, it was getting cold again, and to try to feed the workers and rescuers. And those rescue efforts, they continued that for 4 days, but it took months to clean up that area and to try and do repairs. Because of the stickiness of the molasses and the cold weather, they struggled to clean up and to try and repair damages. And then the other thing that was happening was onlookers were coming to see, and then they were going back home, and they were tracking this stuff like away from the site onto the trains, carrying it all through the rest of the city. The quote on Wikipedia, which was from a Smithsonian article, said everything that a Bostonian touched was sticky. Like all the seats on the trains, there's just footprints everywhere. It's just like you could live, a couple miles away in a completely different neighborhood and you'd have molasses all over everything in town, because people were just going, checking it out or helping, and then leaving, going back home, bringing it with them. Um, at some point, somebody found out that seawater was really good for trying to dissolve some of the sugar and clean up this molasses. So they started pumping in like seawater from the harbor, and then sand, to try and absorb it. And I guess the harbor was brown for weeks afterwards. And there are people who say, I don't know if they say it like nowadays, but there are people who said that like every summer it would like smell like molasses, like just for decades and decades afterwards, which I don't know if you heard that, but
No, I didn't hear that, but I would imagine that would be true too.
yeah, I mean, it would just have gone everywhere. And these are, brick buildings, wooden structures. It would just seep into everything. And it would
Mhm.
be like in the cracks and then into like the sewer system. And so into the ground. And then it would just come right back up. And I just can't even imagine. I can't even
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah, I would imagine where the bridges and stuff, it wouldn't be absorbed because the material is non-porous.
Right, right.
And even if there was some material that was porous, like cement,
Yeah.
it would seep into that eventually, especially if they watered it down with to seawater.
Yeah.
And yes, like anything else, as soon as it warms up, like you talked about in the summertime, you get a couple of weeks of really hot, humid weather, and all that stuff comes up, and you get
Yeah.
smells, and you say, "Where the heck is that coming from?"
Right.
So,
Why does the whole town smell like
yeah,
molasses? It's
exactly.
just crazy. And molasses has a very distinctive smell as well.
Yeah.
I guess, I know it's an awful thing to say, but I guess it's more fortunate that this did not happen in the summer because can you imagine the bugs?
Oh,
It would have been awful.
yeah, I imagine it would have
It
been.
it just would have been flies and all kinds of other bugs everywhere, wasps and all kinds
Yeah.
of other disgusting. Oh my goodness. And seagulls too.
Mm.
Seagulls would have been insane at
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
time. So yeah, I mean it was pretty awful. And if you look, I recommend that you guys go online and look at some of the pictures. Me describing it does it absolutely no justice. Especially because I'm me. But like I looked at some of these pictures last night and just how big this tank was and just how like wrecked it was. Like you can literally see the pieces of the tank in the pictures in the aftermath because
Uh,
they took pictures right away. You
yeah.
could see all the like the ground is wet, whether it was like the seawater, whether they had already washed it away, or whether it was actually molasses. Like the ground is just soaking wet.
Yeah.
People standing around, like the bridge. I could see the not the bridge, but the elevated railway, how damaged that was. You could see the structures that were damaged. You could see like just debris everywhere. It's pretty awful. And then I saw like an overhead map that showed how much of the neighborhood was affected, and it was like all of it. It was like the majority of the North End were
Yeah,
impacted
and
by
you
that.
you know, can you imagine? Boggles my mind. Just think about this:
Yeah,
is that if the EPA, which wasn't in place then,
yeah,
would be involved, and what would happen from there? There would be a huge amount of effort, or maybe restrictions into
hmm
what they could do to clean up.
right.
So.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Because I think, I mean, I guess it was good that we didn't have the industry that we have now, but I can imagine that there would be some different ways to clean that up that weren't seawater.
Yep. Yep.
It would probably be chemical in nature.
Mhm.
Honestly, I can't imagine. I can't imagine because I've never been part of anything like that anyway, but I can't imagine the scale of that. I mean, we spill our coffee and we get all panicky. Like,
Well, we've seen it. I've seen it in action when there would be a construction for building houses, and they would dig up these
right.
old farms, and they would find these tanks of whatever material buried in the ground,
Oh,
and
sure.
it stops the project, stops it cold,
Oh, sure.
and rightfully so, to try to figure out how to deal with what they found in the ground. And I would imagine it would be the same in this case. Obviously, that wasn't how it was handled back then, and perhaps it would have gone the same way because what you need to do is take care of it as quickly as you can
Right.
because first order of business is to save lives, rescue and recovery. So
Yeah. Yeah, and it looks like, I mean, it looks like they jumped into action and it was really cool to read about the cadets that
mhm.
just, they probably didn't even have to be told. They just heard the crash and ran
Yeah,
and just sprung into action, which is just amazing. And the fire department, the Red Cross, I mean, they're all just right there. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to learn about the aftermath of this. I'm not going to go too much into like the lawsuit part of it, but it is notable that from this came one of the first class action lawsuits in the country.
yeah,
The USIA, or the Industrial Alcohol Company, they tried to claim that it was anarchists that had blown up the tank because they were a munitions factory. I can imagine that was very quickly shut down. Like, yeah, listen, we have witnesses. We were there. There were no anarchists. It was 12:30 in the afternoon. Like, that's not
yeah.
what happened. It took 3 years of hearings to award a little under $700,000 in damages, which today would be like 12 million, about $12 million.
Yeah.
But the silver lining was all the regulation that came out of this. And this is one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this as well today, and our related story that we'll be doing either next episode or shortly after, with the Coconut Grove fire is the regulations that come out of it, which I think are important, because the only thing you can do and the best thing you can do is to learn from these things that happen and to improve from then on. If you just keep going as you were going, well, that's terrible. So from this disaster, a lot of new regulations came from this, including engineers had to be professionally certified, which is like when you hear some of these things, you're like, okay, duh.
Mhm.
But none of this was in place. And I know it was like, you know, it wasn't even 1920 yet, but still, you know, um, plans for structures needed to be signed and sealed by a registered engineer before they would get permits. Building inspectors were required to inspect structures, which is like, okay, they had building inspectors. Why weren't they already required to inspect structures? Isn't that their job to inspect because they're building inspectors? But I guess there weren't a lot of laws in the commercial industry.
You know,
You have one
it's
job. You're a building
yeah. Well,
inspector.
it's true. It's true, and I'm not sure where where things were in terms of building inspectors' responsibilities back then. But I
Yeah,
can tell you from experience is that maybe on a local level, maybe a city might be different. But on a local level, uh, is that the inspectors there is a limit of their liability,
right,
uh, and consequently, I think it there's an inhibition to go to a certain level. To be more specific, they'll come in and they'll look at something, and if there's something at fault and something happens because of after the inspection, they are not the ones that are at fault. The ones that are
right,
at fault are the person who installed it.
right.
You
Well,
know, so
yeah,
it makes me wonder about what would be the point of having an inspector if they're not going to certify something to be done correctly. Now, I
right.
will say that that is not an indictment of every inspector. That this may be something that happens more at the local level rather than at the larger levels.
Hmm.
But, from the standpoint of having engineers, and I've been involved with seeing tanks put together and stuff. And, welds have to be inspected. And
Right.
after welds are inspected, they have to be, it has to be tested,
Right. Yeah,
tested under pressure. All those things have to happen.
sure.
Um, what an inspector will do is certify that these tests have been done. And that's really comes down to some things that are in place now. It's the ISO regulations, where when you have manufacturing, you
Hmm.
have to you have to document how you're going to do everything, how you're going to inspect it. And then
Right.
somebody comes in and certifies that you have done it to
Yeah.
your standards.
I mean, yeah, that's great. And it's interesting to think about all of that came about because of bad things that happened in the past, you know.
Mhm.
Also zoning laws. This is something that I didn't think of, but it makes perfect sense. They didn't have the kind of zoning laws before this happened that would have prevented a lot of injury. This was a this was an area that was a commercial mixed residential area. And
Yeah, you,
so y-
mhm. You're
yeah,
right.
right?
Yeah, you'd never have that nowadays.
Never have that. And it's because
Yep,
of this.
yep,
Basically you're not allowed to build like factory buildings and tanks and industrial stuff in a neighborhood. Which is like that is such that is so basic. But
yep.
again, cities historically, you can totally see that happening. And in other countries, they still have problems with that sort of thing.
Right.
There's limited space in a city, there's limited money in a lot of cities, and this was a time when they hadn't learned that lesson yet, I guess. But yeah, so keeping industrial buildings out of residential areas, who'd have thought?
Mhm.
Um, Individuals and corporations were after this were held responsible for deaths due to negligence. So that statement says to me that they weren't before.
Right.
So if
Yep.
something like this happened, and I'm sure there were things that happened, industrial accidents that happened because of negligence, the corporations just weren't held accountable, which is like now when I'm reading about this disaster and about what caused it, I'm like disgusted at the head of this company. But in 1915, there wasn't any accountability, legal accountability for something like this. So like why would you care if something happened? It's still disgusting. I still feel like horrified at it. But like from a business perspective, you can totally see how these people would be like, yeah, just build a
Yeah.
tank. If it blows up, a couple people might die and then we'll just build another one. Like what's
Yeah.
the problem?
Well,
They're
yeah.
just
I mean,
workers.
and yeah, you just to correct you a little bit, you said 1915. It should be 1919. But
19, well, no, 1915 when it was built.
when it was
That's what I
built,
meant.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
1919 when it blew up 4 years later, but
Right.
it
Right.
was built in 1915. Yeah.
Right. Which says that you're right. The regular, and I'm sure even with these regulations, I I would I would bet, and I thought I read it somewhere that
Mm,
it wasn't until maybe 1925 before
yeah.
all things were settled, which meaning all settled, which be that these changes could have been put into effect.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the first class action lawsuit took 3 years. So
Mhm.
3 years from 1919 or 1920. Who knows when it was actually started?
Yeah, yeah,
And
right.
then a couple more years for people to actually get there, and then other lawsuits that followed, showing negligence or showing responsibility. Yeah, but it does make sense. It was 1925 before everything was settled. It boggles the mind, but it's not that surprising, I guess I could say.
No, no, it's not. We know how long things can take to be resolved.
Yeah.
Because like you said, I mean, we're really talking about the aftermath more than
Yes,
anything else. You know,
exactly. And they learned a lot. I mean, I'm glad they learned a lot from it, but it's
mhm.
just crazy that I don't know. It's just kind of like when you look at, I guess the saying hindsight is 2020 is there for a reason. But
Yep.
all of these things, the construction codes that were instituted afterwards, the rules that were put in place afterwards, and when they actually looked at the people inspected the tank and found all the flaws that were in it. Like you knew those flaws were there before the workers were telling this guy this,
It would have stopped. Yeah. Yeah. They
you
would have.
would have.
Yeah.
It's just crazy to think that you have to learn your lesson from a disaster like this instead of like fixing a problem that's so clearly gonna happen before it happens.
Yeah. It reminds me of a conversation we were having about the industry now with the space industry,
Yeah.
in that you don't see rockets ships do not go up unless there's like nothing wrong. I
Yeah.
mean, they stop it for anything,
Hmm.
and that is the way it should be. Is that when there are things that are not meeting to the standards, or you have an issue, you can't just go, yeah, that's going to be okay.
Right.
No, you have to, stop. Yeah, being in manufacturing, there's always a lot of pressure to move it along, and we would have an inspector in place who had the power to stop anything.
Hmm.
And that is appropriate, because frequently manufacturing supervisor or a higher up can say, no, no, by my authority, let it go. And that is not what you want to have happen. You want to have checks and balances in place.
Well, of course, because I mean, when profit is the goal, or publicity is the goal, or saving face is the goal, if you don't have rules in place to institute safety, those kind of things can get out of control real quick.
Yep.
And sometimes, even when those things are in place, it doesn't work out like with the Challenger thing. I mean,
Yep.
there were so many people who knew exactly what was going to happen, and they told their bosses such, and the bosses were like, yeah, but like everybody's watching. Like,
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
everybody's watching, and wouldn't it be really terrible if something really bad happened while everybody was watching? Yeah, but we have this thing we got to do. It was just, oh my gosh, that's a story for another day.
Yep. Yep.
But it's
For
the
sure.
same kind of thing with this, and it's the same kind of thing with the landslide that happened in Wales, with all that coal sludge
Mhm.
that
Yep.
killed all those kids. Uh, it was because of, there's a problem. There's a big problem going to happen. And the people in charge are just like, yeah, but we got to get this alcohol produced for the munitions.
Yep.
Prohibition's coming, guys.
Yep.
We got to
Yep.
do this fast, and I'm not really concerned. And hey, Mr. Inspector, this tank is a piece of shit. I don't know who
Mhm.
built it, but it's crap. The
Yep.
inspector's like, yeah, but my buddy slash boss told me I could have this job, and just, what, paint it brown. It's fine.
Yep. Yep.
It just drives me crazy. And it's just like, I don't know, it's infuriating. I don't know. And it also reminds me of that time I got called for jury duty, and it was a civil case, and it was two companies arguing against each other about who was liable for the who was the one who was accountable for the explosion that happened in a factory.
Yeah.
And the one guy, the lubricant manufacturer guy, said, it's not me, it's the manufacturer of this one part. And the one part manufacturer said, it's not me, it's the lubricant guy. And they were suing each other and arguing over who should pay. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. And then I looked at the list of witnesses to the explosion, and all but like two or three of them, it had a little D next to their name because they died in the explosion.
Yep. Yep.
And all of these people died in this explosion in this factory. And here are these two CEOs arguing over, I don't think we should pay for it. I think you should pay for it. And I was like, I don't know. I'm a tree hugger hippie.
Mm.
I was disgusted, and I did not want to be on that jury.
Yeah.
I don't think I could be. I don't want either one of you fuckers to get anything. But anyway, I know that wasn't what the case was about, but
Yeah.
so yeah, so that's the Boston molasses flood. Not very funny, but I guess when I was a kid it seemed cartoonish.
Yep. Yep.
About a bunch of molasses, in the streets. But thank you for your stories about the North End and about Boston. It's a pleasure to hear that stuff, and I like to hear a lot more. I try to picture the best I can what those areas were like, and it's really cool to hear about that.
Yeah, yeah. It's and it's good for me from a nostalgia standpoint to revisit that.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Yeah, it's like the good old days, right?
Yeah, part of my childhood, you know. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you said before that you were familiar with that area, you knew exactly where it was, and I imagine you used to go to uh the playground that was there or the park that
yeah,
was there?
there was a down the road from that, you know, maybe a few blocks was a playground and a swimming area.
Yeah.
There was a swimming pool. My mom used to walk the whole brood of us across the bridge to go to that area to swim and spend the
Mm.
day on a summer day out there. So
That's really cool. Yeah,
yeah,
I guess well where the tank was, they obviously didn't rebuild, but the concrete slab that it was on, I think they threw a bunch of dirt over it and I think that's where like the baseball diamond is.
yeah.
Yeah, so that's crazy. That's just crazy. Um yeah, so folks, thank you for listening to our episode, another episode about Boston. We're obsessed. If you would like, you can send us an email at mochiverse@gmail.com, MOCCIAVERSE@gmail.com. Let us know what you think. You can go over to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating and write us a review if you would please. It would help us get some visibility so that some people can listen to these episodes and share it with people they know. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell anybody that you think would be interested in listening. It would really be cool to have some feedback. It would really be cool to know that somebody out there is listening. Um, and that's that on that. So,
Okay.
shall we lighten the mood?
Yes, we shall.
All right, give me some dad jokes.
Okay. How did I know my girlfriend thought I was invading her privacy?
How?
She wrote about it in her diary.
Yeah.
Why did the electric car feel discriminated against?
Oh, how come?
Because the rules weren't current.
Okay.
You have to understand electricity to
Yes,
understand that one.
yes,
Yes, yeah.
yes.
I'm such a good navigator. A self driving car once asked me for directions.
That's good.
Why do melons have weddings?
Why?
You know they can't elope.
Oh no.
What did the bison say when his son left the ranch?
Bye, son.
There you go. What watch what you say around egg whites. They just can't take the yolk. Okay. Blah, blah, blah,
Very
blah.
good.
I'm so good at fixing things. My motto is if it is broke, I'll still fix it. Uh, why why hmm,
Where? Where?
where?
Where?
Were the pumpkins? That doesn't
Wait.
make any sense.
That's because of
Where
a
do the
typo.
pumpkins have their meeting?
Where?
In the gourd room. What the
Oh,
hell?
okay. It was
Okay. What
because the typo really threw you
it
off.
really threw me off. I'm going, what? Okay. What's the
That's
what's the
okay.
best way to save your dad jokes?
Where?
In a database.
I love that.
Yeah.
That was good.
I, I got a new pen that can write underwater.
Uh-huh.
It can write other words too. Think about it.
I did. I
I
like
just
that.
had to.
That's good. I like that. Yeah, I can write lots of things.
Yeah.
Oh, folks, that is it. We will see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Oh,
Ciao for
wow.
now.
Ciao for now.
Daddy wasn't finding a bow wow. Daddy wasn't finding a bow wow. I've got a little cat. I'm very fond of that. I'd rather have a pink bow wow.
Watch what you say around egg yolks.
Nope.
Or is it
Start that one
Wait a
again.
minute. Why did see? I get my words mixed again. What? I know I did the punchline before I did the
Yes,
joke.
you did. That's fine. I'll edit that. I'm gonna put that one at the end.
Yeah.